Welcome to American Legacy Stories, where we journey back to the heart of the 20th century to uncover the quiet courage that shaped a nation. We share the intimate, often untold tales of the women who, against the backdrop of a rapidly changing America, faced their trials with unyielding grace and built the foundations of our future. The air in Havenwood, Ohio, had always tasted of sweet corn and damp earth, but in the summer of 1946, all Martha Mee Thompson could taste was dust. It was a fine, gritty powder that settled on the tongue and clung to the back of the throat, the ghost of the life she'd planned. She stood on the narrow porch of the two-bedroom house that still smelled of Samuel's pipe tobacco and Old Spice, her fingers tracing the impossibly sharp creases of the American flag the Army had sent home in his place. It was heavy, this triangle of striped wool and embroidered stars, far heavier than the man it represented. Samuel had been light, full of laughter that seemed to float up from his toes and burst out of him, scattering across a room like dandelion seeds. This flag was dense, solid, an anchor of grief that threatened to pull her down into the splintered floorboards of the porch he had built with his own hands. The sun beat down on the back of her neck, a relentless, indifferent heat that baked the sorrow into her skin. Below the porch, her small vegetable garden was beginning to wilt, the tomato leaves curling at the edges in a silent, thirsty plea. She should water them. Samuel had been so proud of those tomatoes, his big boys, he'd called them, coaxing them from spindly seedlings into robust, fruit-laden vines. But the thought of nurturing something, of encouraging life when his had been so brutally extinguished, felt like a betrayal. Every corner of this town, every familiar face that offered a pitying glance at the grocery store, every peal of the church bells on Sunday morning was a fresh wound. They all held a piece of him. The way Mr. Henderson at the hardware store still called her Sam's girl. The spot by the creek where he'd carved their initials into the bark of an old oak. The worn pew in the Methodist church where his hand had always found hers during the sermon. Leaving seemed the only logical escape, a surgical removal of memory. Her mother's letters, smelling faintly of lavender and desperation, urged her to come home to Pennsylvania to be looked after, to let them absorb her sorrow into the family's collective hum. But as she stood there, the weight of the flag in her arms, a stubborn, unfamiliar seedling of resolve pushed its way through the barren soil of her grief. To run would be to admit that Samuel's life, their life, was nothing more than a ghost story. To stay, to walk these streets and tend this garden and sleep in this bed, was to insist that he had been real, that what they had built, however briefly, mattered. Her decision came not as a shout, but as a quiet whisper that settled in her bones. She would stay. She would rebuild not on the ashes of her old life, but on the foundations he had left behind, no matter how much it hurt. The porch swing, which Samuel had hung just before he shipped out, creaked in the slight breeze, an empty, rhythmic sigh. She clutched the flag tighter, the sharp point of a star pressing into her palm, and for the first time in months, she met the gaze of the setting sun without flinching. Martha Mee had grown up in a small Pennsylvania coal town where the sky was perpetually smudged with gray, and every family bore the same weary resilience. Her father, a miner with hands permanently stained black, had taught her that survival was a matter of grit and that dreams were a luxury you earned, not one you were given. She had met Samuel at a church social when he was visiting his aunt. He was different from the boys she knew. He didn't have the miner's stoop or the cynical curve to his lip. He had a farmer's hands, broad and capable, but his eyes held a draftsman's precision and a dreamer's spark. He spoke of Ohio, of its wide-open fields and the neat little town of Havenwood where he was going to build houses, sturdy homes for families to fill with life. He had courted her with letters, his handwriting a steady, reassuring slant across the page, describing the house he was building for them, the one with the big porch and the window over the kitchen sink that looked out onto a future garden. When he'd sent her the train ticket tucked inside a copy of Leaves of Grass, she hadn't hesitated. Marrying Samuel was like stepping out of a coal-dusted shadow and into the sun. Their 2 years together in Havenwood had been a study in quiet contentment. He worked for a local builder, learning the trade, and she made their small house a home, bottling peaches, sewing curtains, and filling the rooms with the scent of freshly baked bread. Her most prized possession from that time was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a cardinal that Samuel had whittled for her on their first anniversary. He'd sanded the pine smooth as river stone and painstakingly painted it a vibrant red, capturing the bird's jaunty crest and defiant posture. "Cardinals stay all winter," he'd told her, pressing it into her palm. "They don't run from the cold, they just sing a little louder." The bird sat on the windowsill over the sink, a steadfast speck of color against the vast, lonely landscape of her days. When the draft notice came, it felt like a stone thrown through the placid surface of their life. The war was something that happened in newsreels, a distant rumble of thunder. It wasn't meant to reach into the heart of Ohio and pluck a house builder from his young wife. The day he left on the train, the platform was a sea of tear-streaked faces and brave smiles. "I'll be back before the New Year's snow melts," he'd promised, his voice tight. "You keep our garden growing, Marty," she had. She detended the tomatoes and the beans and the squash with a ferocious devotion, as if their survival was intrinsically linked to his. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday in early June, delivered by a fresh-faced boy who couldn't meet her eyes. "A sniper in France," that was all it said. The words were clinical, impersonal, a sterile report that couldn't possibly contain the vibrant, laughing life of her Samuel. The town had wrapped her in a suffocating blanket of sympathy. Casseroles appeared on her doorstep, whispers of "poor thing" followed her in the street, and well-meaning friends tried to fill the cavernous silence in her house with platitudes. But their kindness felt like a confirmation of her new identity, the widow Thompson, a tragic figure, a story to be told with a shake of the head. It was this label, more than the grief itself, that propelled her toward her decision on the porch. Her mother's pleas to come home were a siren's song of retreat, a return to being a daughter, a child to be cared for. But she was a wife. Samuel's wife, and this house, this town, this life, this was the legacy he had started, and she would be damned if she let it die with him. The little wooden cardinal on the windowsill seemed to watch her, its painted eye a tiny black dot of challenge. She would not run from the cold. She would learn to sing a little louder. Her first act of defiance was to get a job. In 1946, the women who had flooded the factories during the war were being gently but firmly ushered back to their kitchens. A woman's place was in the home, especially a respectable widow. But respectability didn't pay the property tax or put food on the table. Samuel's life insurance was a pittance, enough to bury him and not much more. Martha walked into the office of the Havenwood Canning Company, her hands clammy and her heart hammering against her ribs. The air inside was thick with the acidic sweetness of cooking tomatoes and the rhythmic clatter of machinery. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his shirt, looked at her over his spectacles with an expression of weary skepticism. "It's not women's work, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone dismissive. "It's hot. It's loud. I'm a hard worker," Martha insisted, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I'm not afraid of heat." He saw the desperation she was trying to hide, and perhaps a flicker of the same grit he saw in the men who worked for him. He hired her for the sorting line, a probationary position that paid 65 cents an hour. The work was grueling. For 10 hours a day, she stood on a concrete floor, the roar of the machines a constant assault, her world narrowed to a conveyor belt of rolling vegetables. Her job was to pick out the bruised, the rotten, the imperfect. Her hands were perpetually stained, her back ached with a dull, constant fire, and the smell of boiled corn and vinegar clung to her hair and clothes. The other women on the line were a mixed bunch. There were older women, widows like herself, their faces etched with a permanent resignation. There were younger, unmarried girls saving for a wedding dress, their chatter a bright, frivolous counterpoint to the din. And then there was Clara. Clara Kowalski was a few years older than Martha, a tall, raw-boned woman with sharp blue eyes and a tongue to match. Her husband had come back from the Pacific with a leg full of shrapnel and a soul full of ghosts, unable to hold a steady job. Clara worked with a fierce, angry energy, her movements quick and efficient. She didn't offer Martha any sympathy. In fact, for the first few weeks, she barely spoke to her at all. The reality of her new life was a stark, jarring contrast to the one she had known. The camaraderie she'd expected to find among the working women was fractured by exhaustion and petty rivalries. The town that had once felt like a warm embrace now felt like a cage, its bars forged from their expectations of who she should be. "You ought to be thinking about finding a new husband," her neighbor, Mrs. Gable, advised one afternoon, peering over the fence as Martha weeded her neglected garden. "A young woman like you shouldn't be alone." Martha just smiled, a tight, polite curve of her lips, and dug her trowel deeper into the soil. The evenings were the hardest. The silence in the house was a physical presence. She'd turn on the radio, letting the cheerful jingles and the dramatic voices of the shadow fill the empty space. But it was a hollow substitute for Samuel's low chuckle or the sound of him whistling as he worked in his small woodshop in the shed. One Friday, after a particularly brutal week, Martha found an extra $1 in her pay envelope. She turned to find Mr. Abernathy standing behind her. "You're a good worker, Thompson," he grunted, avoiding her eyes. "Don't let anyone tell you different." It wasn't praise, not really, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a single brick laid in the foundation of her new life. That night, walking home, she felt a shift inside her. The ache in her back was still there, the loneliness was still waiting for her behind the front door, but for the first time, she felt the quiet, satisfying weight of her own survival. She had earned this ache. She had earned this silence. It was hers. Life settled into a rhythm dictated by the factory whistle and the changing seasons. The initial shock of her new reality gave way to a weary sort of acceptance. Martha's friendship with Clara blossomed in the shared misery of the canning line, nurtured by hurried conversations shouted over the roar of the machinery, and shared cigarettes during their 10-minute breaks. Clara was stripped of all pretense, her observations as sharp and unsentimental as a paring knife. "Don't you mind them," Clara said one day, gesturing with her chin towards a group of women whispering and glancing in Martha's direction. "They're just jealous you're not crying into your dishwater all day. Misery loves company, but it can't stand a woman who puts on a clean dress and goes to work." "I feel like I'm a specimen in a jar," Martha confessed, rubbing her sore hands. "The town widow, let 'em look," Clara snorted. "You've got more backbone than all of them put together. My Stanley, he sits in his chair all day, staring at the wall. The war took his legs, but it took his spirit too. Sometimes I think the ones who came back are more lost than the ones who didn't." The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile offering of trust. It was the first time Martha realized that everyone was fighting a private war, and that her grief, as all-consuming as it felt, was not unique. She began to see the town not as a museum of her past, but as a community of flawed, struggling people. She and Clara started a small tradition. Every other Sunday, they would go for a walk after church, exploring the woods and fields around Havenwood. During these walks, the town and its judging eyes would fall away, and they could speak freely. They talked about their husbands, the ones they had and the ones they'd lost. They talked about the rising cost of bacon, the plots of the radio serials, and their quiet, secret dreams. Clara wanted to save enough money to buy a small flock of chickens. Martha just wanted a day without the bone-deep ache of loneliness. Her external struggle was financial. The 65 cents an hour barely covered her expenses. There were moments of sheer panic, like the week the water heater broke, forcing her to choose between hot baths and a full pantry. She learned to be frugal, to patch and mend, to turn every scrap from her garden into a meal. She sold her excess tomatoes and cucumbers at a small table at the end of her driveway, the small handful of coins she earned each week a victory against the encroaching tide of poverty. Her subplot with the community took a turn one evening at a church potluck. She had almost not gone, the thought of facing the cheerful, pitying couples an ordeal, but Clara had insisted. "You can't hide forever," she'd said, pushing a freshly baked apple pie into Martha's hands. "And besides, my pie is better than Betty Gable's and I want witnesses." At the potluck, a man named Frank Miller introduced himself. He was a widower himself, a quiet, kind man who ran the local feed store. He spoke to her not as Sam's widow, but as Martha. He asked about her garden, about her work at the cannery. It was a simple, normal conversation, the kind she hadn't had with a man in over a year, and it was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "Heard you had a problem with your water heater," Frank said, his gaze direct. "I'm pretty handy with that sort of thing. I could take a look if you'd like, no charge." The offer was a crossroads. Accepting it would be an admission of need, a crack in the armor of self-sufficiency she had so carefully constructed. But it was also an offer of simple human kindness, something she desperately craved. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Please call me Frank." This interaction marked the beginning of a subtle shift in her standing. She was no longer just a tragic figure. She was a woman making her own way, a woman who worked hard, a woman who was beginning to engage with the world again. The first arc of her survival was closing, not with a grand victory, but with the quiet promise of a repaired water heater and a new acquaintance. The light cliffhanger was internal. Could she allow herself to accept help, to let someone new into the fortress of her grief, without feeling like she was betraying the memory of the man she had loved? The path of her internal evolution was not a straight line, but a meandering trail with hidden roots to trip over and unexpected clearings that let the sun in. Frank Miller came by the following Saturday, as promised. He was quiet and methodical, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the pipes and wrenches. As he worked, he spoke of his late wife, Helen, of her love for irises and her terrible fear of spiders. He spoke of her illness matter-of-factly, with a sorrow that was smoothed by time but still present, like a worn stone in his pocket. Martha found herself responding in kind, sharing stories of Samuel, of his terrible singing voice and the way he could fix anything with a bit of twine and sheer optimism. "It's not a betrayal, you know," Frank said, wiping his hands on a rag, his voice low. "Talking about them, it's how we keep them with us." The conversation opened a valve inside her. For months, she had guarded her memories of Samuel, keeping them locked away like fragile treasures. To speak of him with someone who understood the unique topography of loss felt like a release. When the water heater was fixed and hot water once again flowed from the tap, it felt like more than a simple repair. It was a small, warm victory against the cold tide of her circumstances. Her friendship with Clara deepened into a sisterhood forged in the heat of the cannery and the quiet understanding of shared struggles. They helped each other through hardships big and small. When Clara's son, young Paul, came down with a bad case of the croup, Martha sat with him for 2 nights, applying mustard plasters and telling him stories so Clara could get some rest. When Martha's roof sprang a leak during a fierce thunderstorm, it was Clara's husband, Stanley, who surprised them both by climbing a ladder in the rain and patching the hole. He didn't say much, but the act itself was a form of speech, a crack in the shell of his own post-war trauma. These small, interlocking acts of kindness began to reweave the social fabric of her life. She was no longer an island. The dialogue of her life changed. "How are you holding up?" was replaced with "Can you spare an egg, Marty?" And "Did you hear that new Perry Como song on the radio?" She even found herself laughing again, real, unburdened laughter, usually at something dry and witty Clara H. Ad said, one afternoon, Clara looked at her across the conveyor belt, a rare, soft smile on her face. "You look different," she said over the noise. "What do you mean?" Martha yelled back. "You don't look so haunted." The observation struck Martha with the force of truth. The ghost of Samuel was still with her, but he no longer walked in front of her, obscuring her path. He walked beside her, a cherished memory, not a constant, painful presence. She began to take small risks to reclaim pieces of her old life. She started tending her garden with renewed passion, finding a deep, grounding satisfaction in the cycle of planting, nurturing, and harvesting. She took the wooden cardinal Samuel had carved and moved it from the kitchen windowsill to the mantelpiece in the living room, a promotion from a private reminder to a public declaration. It wasn't a shrine to her grief, but a symbol of her endurance, the cardinal that doesn't fly from the cold. Frank began stopping by occasionally, sometimes with a bag of feed for her small flock of chickens, a venture inspired by Clara, sometimes just to sit on the porch swing and talk for a spell. Their conversations were easy, unhurried. He never pushed, never presumed. He was simply a friend, a steady presence in a world that had felt so unstable. But his presence also stirred a quiet conflict within her. The thought of a future that included a man other than Samuel felt both impossible and, to her shame, strangely appealing. Was it possible to love again? Or was her heart a finite space already filled to capacity? She was growing stronger, more resilient, but her emotional landscape was becoming more complex. The clarity of pure grief was being replaced by the murkier, more complicated waters of a new life, with its potential for new joys and new heartbreaks. The summer of 1952 arrived with a suffocating wave of heat and a new, terrifying word that rippled through Havenwood: polio. It started as a whisper, a story from a neighboring county about a child who went to bed with a fever and woke up unable to move his legs. But soon, the whispers became headlines in the Havenwood Chronicle. The local swimming pool was closed. The movie theater was half empty. Mothers kept their children indoors, exchanging fearful, speculative glances over their fences. The disease was a terrifyingly democratic predator, striking without regard for wealth or status, its cause a mystery, its consequences devastatingly clear. The fear was a palpable thing in the cannery, an invisible spore that settled on everyone. Conversations were dominated by remedies and rumors, a poultice of onions, a shot of whiskey, the avoidance of new people. For Martha, the epidemic dredged up the familiar helplessness she'd felt after Samuel's death. It was another invisible enemy, another random, cruel twist of fate that could shatter a life in an instant. The crisis reached her doorstep on a sticky August evening. Clara appeared at her back door, her face a mask of terror, her sharp blue eyes wide with panic. "It's Paul," she choked out, her voice ragged. "He has a fever. His neck is stiff." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Young Paul, a boisterous 7-year-old with a cowlick that wouldn't stay down and a perpetually scraped knee, Martha's heart seized. The doctor had already been, confirming their worst fears. He'd advised bed rest and prayer, his own helplessness a chilling testament to the disease's power. The hospital in the city was full, and a quarantine sign was to be posted on the Kowalski's door in the morning. "No one in, no one out." "Stanley, he's not taking it well," Clara whispered, her big frame trembling. "He just keeps saying it's a punishment for what he saw in the war. He's just sitting there staring." Martha didn't hesitate. She packed a small bag with a change of clothes, the remainder of her savings from a mason jar in the cupboard, and the first aid kit Samuel had always kept in the kitchen. She walked across the lawn to the Kowalskis' small house, ignoring the fearful twitch of Mrs. Gable's curtains next door. The house was stiflingly hot and smelled of sickness and fear. Stanley was slumped in his armchair, a ghost in his own home. Paul was in his small bed, his face flushed, whimpering softly. This was the convergence. The historical event, the polio scare, had crashed directly into her personal world, threatening the life of a child she loved and the stability of the friend who had become her anchor. Her decision was not a conscious one. It was a pure, instinctual reaction forged by years of quiet resilience. She was no longer the frightened young widow. She was Martha Mee Thompson, a woman who knew how to face down the cold. "Clara," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the swirling chaos. "Go get some sleep, I'll sit with him." "But you can't," Clara protested, her eyes filling with tears. "You'll be quarantined. You'll lose your job. Mr. Abernathy will understand," Martha said with a certainty she didn't entirely feel. "And if he doesn't, I'll find another one. We are not going to get through this by being afraid of each other." For the next 2 weeks, Martha's world shrank to the confines of that small, hot house. She and Clara became a silent, efficient team. They bathed Paul in cool water, coaxed spoonfuls of broth between his lips, and read him stories until their throats were raw. Martha's presence seemed to break through Stanley's stupor. He began to help, his movements clumsy at first, then more confident. He fixed a fan to circulate the air, sat by his son's bed for hours, his big, calloused hand resting on Paul's forehead. Frank Miller became their lifeline to the outside world. Every morning, a box of groceries and supplies would appear on the porch. He'd stand at the edge of the lawn, a safe distance away, and they'd shout updates to each other. "How is he?" Frank would call, his face etched with worry. "No change yet," Martha would reply, forcing a hopeful note into her voice. "We need more ice if you can find any," the town watched. Some, like Mrs. Gable, crossed the street to avoid walking past the quarantined house. But others responded with a quiet, powerful wave of community support. Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store left a basket of fresh-baked rolls. Mr. Abernathy sent a note with Frank, tucked inside an envelope with 2 weeks' pay, that said simply, "Your job will be here." This crisis, born of a terrifying historical moment, became the ultimate test of Martha's transformation. She was no longer just surviving. She was leading, nurturing, and holding a family together. She faced her deepest fear, the random, senseless loss of a loved one, not by running, but by walking directly into its path, armed with nothing more than courage and compassion. The fever broke on the 14th day. Paul woke up, his eyes clear, and asked for a glass of milk. He could move his arms, his legs. He was weak, but he was whole. The relief that washed through the small house was so profound it was physically painful, a collective, shuddering exhale of breath. Clara wept silently, her head on Martha's shoulder. Stanley, his face streaked with tears, held his son's hand as if he would never let go. Martha stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street, and knew that something fundamental had shifted. She had faced the fire and had not been consumed. She had walked through the heart of her fear and had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger and more fully herself than she had ever been. The years that followed the polio scare were ones of quiet growth and profound change, not just for Martha, but for the country. The shadow of the Korean War fell across the town, taking a new generation of boys, but the post-war boom was also in full swing. New houses, the kind Samuel had dreamed of building, were sprouting up at the edge of town, and television aerials began to rise from rooftops like strange, metallic trees. Martha's legacy was not written in headlines or etched on plaques. It was woven into the daily fabric of the life she had painstakingly rebuilt. She did not remarry Frank Miller, though their friendship deepened into a comfortable, loving companionship that sustained them both through the years. They were two independent souls who found solace in each other's company, a testament to the fact that a family could be built on something other than a marriage certificate. Her success was measured in the small, significant moments. It was in the pride she felt when Paul Kowalski, a strong and healthy young man, graduated from high school, his parents beaming beside her. It was in the easy laughter shared with Clara over a cup of coffee at the kitchen table, their friendship a sturdy, load-bearing wall in the architecture of their lives. It was in the respect she earned at the cannery, where Mr. Abernathy eventually promoted her to line supervisor, a position of authority few women held. She never became wealthy. She continued to live in the small house Samuel had built, but she made it her own. She replaced the faded curtains, painted the walls a cheerful yellow, and expanded the garden until it was a riot of color and abundance. The house was no longer a monument to a lost past, but a vibrant, living testament to her own endurance. Her greatest sacrifice was perhaps the life she might have had, the children she and Samuel might have raised. But she had found a different kind of motherhood. She had become a second mother to Paul, a confidant to the young women at the factory, and a quiet pillar of the community. She passed on the values she had learned not through lectures, but through her example. The dignity of hard work, the importance of kindness in the face of fear, the quiet strength required to simply keep going. She showed them that a woman's life was not defined by the man she married or the children she bore, but by the content of her character and the resilience of her spirit. Her legacy was in the garden that fed her neighbors during lean times, in the steady, compassionate advice she offered to those in turmoil, in the simple, profound fact that she had stayed. By refusing to be erased by grief, by insisting on her own existence, she had become a landmark in the emotional geography of Havenwood, a fixed point of strength and integrity. She had paved the way not for her own children, but for the daughters of her friends and neighbors, showing them a path that was not defined by convention, but by courage. Her life was her message: you can lose everything and still build a world. One cool, crisp afternoon in the autumn of 1968, more than 20 years after she had stood on the porch with a folded flag, Martha Mee sat in that same spot on the porch swing. She was in her late 40s now, her hair showing streaks of silver at the temples, her hands no longer soft but mapped with the lines of hard work and a life fully lived. The world had changed in ways she could never have imagined. Men were walking in space, a new kind of music was spilling from the radios of passing cars, and the country was once again fractured by a distant, unpopular war. Beside her on the swing sat a young woman, Clara's daughter, born years after the polio scare, a bright, fiery girl with her mother's sharp blue eyes. She was home for the weekend from her first year at the state university, her head full of new ideas about protests and women's liberation. "I don't know how you did it, Aunt Martha," the girl said, her voice a mixture of awe and youthful certainty. Living back then. It was all so restrictive for women. Martha looked out at the street, at the familiar houses and the old oak tree whose leaves were turning a brilliant shade of crimson. She thought of the roar of the cannery, the terror of the quarantine, the crushing weight of loneliness. Then she thought of the quiet satisfaction of her first solo paycheck, the warmth of Clara's friendship, the gentle kindness in Frank Miller's eyes. She reached up to the mantelpiece just inside the door and picked up the small wooden cardinal Samuel had carved for her so long ago. The paint was slightly faded now, chipped in a few places, but the bird's posture was as defiant as ever. She held it in her palm, its smooth, familiar weight a comfort. "We didn't think of it as restrictive," Martha said softly, her gaze distant. "We just thought of it as life, and you learn to do what you have to do. You find your own way to sing." She looked at the wooden bird, and it was no longer just a memory of Samuel or a symbol of her own survival. It was a promise. It was the spirit of a generation of women who had weathered the cold, who had faced the long, hard winters of their lives not with bitterness, but with a stubborn, unrelenting song of hope. She placed the cardinal back on the mantel, its bright red a splash of courage against the fading afternoon light. The porch swing moved back and forth in its slow, familiar rhythm, a quiet, steady heartbeat in the heart of the town that had once been a prison of memory, but had, through sheer force of will, become her home. The life she had built was not the one she had dreamed of, but it was a good life, a true life, a life that was profoundly, unequivocally her own. And in the quiet dignity of that truth, she had found her peace.